Let's talk to God. God of all things, let there be more of you and less of me. Amen. I recently heard a story about a young girl. She's about 2.5 years old, and her parents have had this problem lately with her that they don't quite know how to handle. She's gotten it into her mind that she wants to die. What? When asked about the rationale behind this thought, she responds by saying that if Jesus is in heaven and being with Jesus is supposed to be the happiest we can be, then why wouldn't we want to die sooner so we can be with Jesus? So it's even gotten to the point where she wants to ask her mother how to buy cigarettes. And when her mother tried to explain to her, you might be a little too young to try to buy cigarettes, she said, well, yeah, but I heard if you smoke, then you can die sooner. So while we may laugh about this story or maybe be a little concerned about the well-being of this child, what strikes me about it is not so much that kids really do say the darndest things or, oh my word, a 2.5-year-old girl wants to die, but it's so radical. Radical because such a little child has the insight to realize and vocalize something that we all should know. Why be afraid of death if it means that we get to go home to Christ? But instead of being taken aback by the simple yet impressive intellectual abilities of a child, we are instead uneasy, if not disturbed by these words coming out of her mouth. In reading over the Sermon on the Mount, trying to wrap my head around some words that I could focus in on to speak about, I realized that Jesus' words in this passage are incredibly radical. Right, we've all heard before that Jesus had some pretty strong words to say for his time. But seriously, in just looking at the Beatitudes, words that many have so often repeated from memory, do we really realize what Jesus is saying? Let's first look to the word radical. Now, I know that the Bible and mathematics aren't typically seen as going hand in hand, and I can tell that they don't for Nick necessarily. But let's give it a shot. In math, the word radical is symbolized by that little angular check mark that goes over a number, showing the solver to find the root of that number. Radical, going to the root. And this is just what Jesus is doing in the Beatitudes, going to the root of how we are best to share his love with one another. His words are not shocking because they are unbelievably new concepts that no one has ever thought of before, but because they're so bluntly rudimentary. Meek, merciful, peacemaker, these aren't newfangled words that Jesus came up with, but these, as well as the other attitudes depicted in the beginning of the 5th chapter of Matthew, are the root of who we are called to be. Take Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. We seem to take this as a given. Of course, we'll always have trials in life of some kind or another, but we'll get through it. Things will always get better. Duh, Jesus. Next. But stop and let those words sink in. One of my favorite thoughts on grief comes from one of my favorite authors, Wendell Berry. I don't believe that grief passes away. It has its time and place forever. More time is added to it, it becomes a story within a story, but grief and griever alike endure. And to speak rather frankly, I feel that. I don't just like it or appreciate it, but I feel that. Just a few months ago, I lost my grandmother, who I've always been very close to. Played board games, did all kinds of projects, worked in the garden together, wrote each other countless letters back and forth over the years. And when she was still doing so well health-wise after her diagnosis, I think we all found it hard to fully believe that anything was wrong at all. But life happens, and in late summer, she was called home. Needless to say, it was a hard hit. A couple of months after she had passed, I remember having coffee with a friend. I was talking about how I had been so deeply sad lately, and I couldn't seem to figure out why. So my friend kind of looked at me funny and asked, well, didn't you just lose your grandmother? I said, well, that happened a month or two ago, but that was a while back, so I don't think that has anything to do with it. So my friend kind of leans in and says bluntly but gently, "You know you're still allowed to be sad about that, right?" I kid you not, in my brain, all I'm hearing is, what? And guess what? We can be sad for as long as we like. I learned this past semester that I can indeed be sad and still go to work, write papers, and even hang out with my friends. And what's even better, I will be comforted. We will be comforted. It's not some grand moment where we jump out of bed and there are tiny little blue birds floating around us, singing a song about the sun as a baby deer prances in and brings us our morning coffee. Although, in all seriousness, I think that somewhere deep down, that's what I wanted and expected. But we will receive hugs from friends and handwritten notes from people that we don't expect, and maybe even some much-needed favors. I have a tendency when going through hard times to close myself off from everyone around me. I don't want to answer the phone. I don't want to go out. Just let me sleep, and let me sleep, let me sleep. So naturally, when Grandma passed away, that's what I did. And I can remember thinking, come on, God, now would be a really good time to remind me that you're still around. And I had to silence my phone because it kept buzzing, which was annoying, and I continued to lay there under the covers, trying to convince God to make an appearance somehow. A few hours later, I forced myself out of bed and glanced at my phone to check the time, only to find 5 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and 7 text messages. At first, I was bothered because now I have to call people back and text them back, all of which I had absolutely no desire to do. But as I pushed my phone out of the way, I thought, oh, hey, God. All this time, I kept demanding that God show up when I was at the same time continuing to push away the love that God was sending to me in the form of friends and comforting words. So yes, we can be sad as long as we care to, but at some point, whenever we're ready, God is there to comfort us, simply but radically. Another one of the Beatitudes which we too often skim over is verse number 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Yeah, of course, be peaceful, don't punch people at whim, right. But really listen to those words and think about how truly radical they are. Peacemaking is not exactly what our world favors. More often than not, we as a society don't exactly lean toward peaceful means of conflict resolution. True, we've had our shining moments, but we still continue to fight tooth and nail for that new gaming console on Black Friday. And yes, that tooth and nail is meant quite literally. In violence and aggression, not only in international conflicts throughout history, but even in our very language and daily behavior continues to be all too common. Even growing up, I was never one for fighting with my siblings or friends physically. However, I loved to argue. Truth be told, arguments are still one of my favorite pastimes, which is pretty easy to understand when we consider the fact that I'm always right about everything. But even when we fight with our words instead of our fists or guns, it's still not necessarily peacemaking. Blessed are the peacemakers, but we sure aren't them. But what do I do if I'm supposed to be a peacemaker, but I love to talk and try to prove a point? When Jesus is saying these words, he isn't lining out certain categories of people and divvying up who gets what. Those of you who are poor in spirit, you get the kingdom of heaven. Pure of heart, you can see God, and all of the meek, you get the earth. I feel like many of us have slipped into interpreting this message in that manner on some level. These aren't classifications to fall into, but rather characteristics that we should all take on throughout our lives. What's more is that Jesus isn't asking us to change ourselves so that we fit these molds of peacemaking, these molds of meekness and mercy, but rather that we use our own God-given passions, talents, and abilities to aid us in pursuing these traits. So it's not so much that I can't enjoy arguing, but that I need to be conscious of why I'm arguing. So can I still be a peacemaker? Yes, of course, because believe it or not, I can argue for peace. People have made careers out of doing just that. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Hillary Clinton, both radicals. One of my favorite quotes from famous comedian that I've always considered quite radical is we can't live in a Christian nation and continue to do nothing for the poor unless we admit that either Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or he wasn't, and we just don't care enough to do anything about it. It's not so imperative that we change who we are. The Beatitudes weren't just about righting the wrongs within us, but glorifying the parts of ourselves that the world tells us are bad. Being peaceful, poor, hungry and thirsty for righteousness, mourning. Being a follower of Christ doesn't necessitate that we become different from who we really are. We were brought into this world by a loving, thoughtful Creator. We are all welcomed and encouraged to come as we are in order to bring together the diversity of blessings and talents of many, to glorify and to share in the unending, unwavering, radical love of one. Amen.